The tradition began for Clara Marsh in the silence that followed the closing of a door. She was 22, and the quiet in her small house was a physical thing, a weight in the air that pressed on her chest. Her husband Thomas had been gone 3 days, taken by a fever that burned through him like a prairie fire, and the house felt hollowed out, a shell that echoed with his absence. Quote, "Then came the knock. 3 women from the church stood on her porch, their faces set in practiced sympathy, each holding a covered dish. One held a chicken pot pie, its crust a perfect, sorrowful gold. Another, a loaf of dark bread. The third, a simple apple crumble. They said little, just pressed the food into her hands, patted her arm, and left. They had not tried to fill the silence with words. They had filled it with the scent of baked bread and stewed apples. They had given her something to do: eat, wash a plate, survive the next hour. In the 11 years that followed, Clara became one of them. She learned the rotation, the quiet network of care that stitched the community of Tellers Creek together. When a child was sick, a man was injured, or a new baby cried through its first nights, a dish would appear. It was a language spoken in casseroles and stews, a recognition that life was hard and lonely, and no one should face it on an empty stomach. Clara, more than most, understood the grammar of this language. She had been its recipient, and now she was its practitioner, her hands moving with a quiet competence that came from a deep, settled understanding of grief. Her own loneliness had softened over the years, from a sharp, cutting edge to a dull, persistent ache. She ran her small homestead with a capability that earned the town's respect. Her chickens were plump, her garden was neat, and her mending was the finest in the county. She was a fixture in Tellers Creek, a sensible, quiet woman of 31 who had built a life from the ashes of a tragedy. A good life, a solitary one. The list came from Mrs. Albright, the pastor's wife, on a Tuesday morning. It was a short list this month. The Miller boy had broken his leg falling from a hayloft, and the new school teacher was down with a summer flu. At the bottom, one name stood alone, written in Mrs. Albright's hesitant script, Eli Danner. A stillness fell over the small church office. Eli Danner. The name hung in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. His wife, Sarah, had died 2 years ago, a sickness that took her slowly, whittling her away until she was gone. For the first few months, the women had observed the tradition. Casseroles and pies made the journey out to his ranch, 5 miles west of town. But the dishes were often returned untouched, the food left to spoil on the porch. The man himself was a ghost, a tall, silent shape seen occasionally at the general store, his eyes fixed on some distant point of sorrow. He did not engage. He did not invite comfort. Eventually, the town had performed a quiet, collective act of surrender. They had given up on Eli Danner, leaving him to the company of his grief. "The pastor feels we ought to try again, Mrs. Albright said, not quite meeting Clara's eyes. "It's been 2 years. A man can't live on jerky and memories forever." Clara looked at the name. She remembered Eli from before. A solid man, not given to many words, but quick with a smile that showed in his eyes. He and Sarah had been good together, a matched set of quiet strength. She remembered the way he looked at his wife, a steady, unwavering gaze that held a world of unspoken affection. That man was gone, replaced by a husk. "I'll take him Thursday," Clara said. Her voice was even, betraying none of the reluctance she felt. It was not a fear of the man, but a fear of the particular silence his house contained, a silence she knew all too well. Thursday arrived with a sky the color of a washed-out sheet. Clara prepared a beef stew, thick with potatoes and carrots, the kind of meal that felt like an anchor. She packed it in a basket with a wedge of cornbread and a jar of her own peach preserves. The ride out to the Danner Ranch was quiet, the road flanked by fields that were turning from green to gold under the late summer sun. The place looked like the rumors felt. A broken rail on the porch drooped like a weary shoulder. Weeds choked the path to the door. The paint on the house was peeling, exposing the gray, weathered wood beneath. It was a home that had lost its heart. He was on the porch, sitting in a straight-backed chair, staring out at the horizon as if waiting for a storm that had already passed. He was thinner than she remembered, the solid frame now angular and spare. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, Clara thought he would simply wave her away. She stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Mr. Danner," she said, her voice soft but clear, "I brought you some supper." He looked at the basket, then back at her. His eyes were the color of the sky, faded and distant. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Clara climbed the steps and set the basket on a small, dusty table. The porch held only one chair. As she turned to leave, he made a move, almost unconscious, a reflex of a hospitality he had long forgotten. He reached inside the door and pulled out another chair, its legs scraping against the wooden planks. He set it down a few feet from his own. A pause. He did not invite her to sit. He simply created the possibility of it. Clara hesitated. This was the boundary. She could leave the food and go, her duty fulfilled. Or she could cross over into something else, something unspoken and uncertain. She thought of the three women on her porch, of the quiet companionship of their gift. She untied her bonnet strings. As she settled into the chair, the wood groaning softly, he spoke. His voice was rough from disuse, a low rasp. "No one sat there since my wife." The words were not an accusation. They were a statement of fact, as plain and stark as the peeling paint on the house. He was marking the territory of his grief, letting her know she was treading on sacred ground. Clara looked at her hands, resting in her lap. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Danner," she said. It was the standard, inadequate phrase, but it was all she had. He did not reply. She served the stew onto 2 plates she'd brought, the steam rising into the cooling air. They ate in silence. It was not an awkward silence, not entirely. It was a heavy silence, dense with everything that had not been said for 2 years. Clara ate slowly, listening to the sound of the crickets starting their evening chorus and the far-off lowing of a cow. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He ate with a slow, methodical rhythm, his gaze still fixed on the horizon, but he finished every bite. When they were done, she gathered the plates. "I'll be back for the dish," she said. He nodded again, that same slow, minimal gesture. As she rode away, she did not look back, but she felt his eyes on her, a faint pressure between her shoulder blades. She had sat in Sarah Danner's chair, and he had let her. The next Thursday, she returned. She had not been asked. It was not her turn on the rotation. But she baked a chicken and brought it anyway, along with a small jar of wildflowers from her garden. He was on the porch again, as if he had never moved. But something was different. The porch was swept clean, and on the dusty table between the 2 chairs sat 2 glasses of water, beaded with condensation. He had been waiting for her. She sat, and they ate. This time, he spoke a few words. He asked about her ride out, commented on the lack of rain. His sentences were short, practical things, like newly oiled hinges that still creaked a little. She answered in kind, telling him about a fox that had been worrying her henhouse. It was not conversation so much as an exchange of small, smooth stones of fact, a way of acknowledging each other's presence in the world. A rhythm began. Every Thursday, Clara rode out to the Danner ranch. Every Thursday, he was waiting. The porch became their shared space, a small island of quiet companionship in the vast sea of their separate solitudes. She learned the landscape of his silence, the subtle shifts in his posture that spoke more than words. He learned the steady, calming presence of her. He found himself looking forward to the sound of her horse's hooves on the dusty road. Thursday became the day the world came back into focus. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the ranch began to change. One week, the broken porch rail was mended, the new wood a pale scar against the old. The next, the weeds along the path were cut back. He started mending the fences in the near pasture, his movements regaining their old familiar economy. He was a man coming back to himself, one repaired board at a time. Clara saw it all and said nothing. She simply brought the food, sat in the second chair, and shared the quiet with him. She was tending to his grief, she told herself, just as she had for so many others. But this was different. With the others, she had been an emissary from the world of the living, a brief visitor to the land of sorrow. With Eli, she felt as if she were a fellow citizen of that country, and they were slowly, together, finding their way back. Inside Eli's mind, something was thawing. For 2 years, his life had been a flat, gray landscape. Sarah's absence was the sky, the ground, the air he breathed. He had tended his cattle out of rote memory, his hands performing tasks his mind barely registered. He had let the ranch slide into disrepair because it seemed to reflect the ruin inside him. It felt honest. Clara's presence was like the first hint of color after a long winter. It started as just a disruption, an unwelcome intrusion into the perfect, seamless bubble of his morning. But her quiet persistence wore away at his resistance. She asked nothing of him. She did not pry or offer platitudes. She just sat with him, her presence as solid and unassuming as the cornbread she brought. He started seeing the ranch not as a monument to his loss, but as a place where this woman came to sit. He saw the peeling paint through her eyes and felt a prickle of something he hadn't felt in years: shame. It was quickly followed by a different, more constructive impulse. He found his tools, the familiar weight of the hammer in his hand, a comfort. Mending the rail, he felt a flicker of purpose. He was not just fixing a piece of wood. He was making the place decent for her. For Thursday, he found himself thinking about her on other days. He wondered what she was doing in her neat little house. So garden was faring. He remembered the calm competence of her hands as she served the food, the way a stray piece of hair would sometimes escape her bonnet. These were small, simple observations, but they were the first thoughts he'd had in 2 years that were not about the past. They were about the present. They were about Clara. Teller's Creek, however, had its own rhythm, and it was one of observation and speculation. The sight of Clara Marsh's buggy heading west every Thursday evening did not go unnoticed. At the general store, heads nodded together over barrels of flour and bolts of calico. Every week, regular as clockwork, Martha Simmons observed to the storekeeper's wife. A widow has no business spending her evenings on a man's porch. Especially not that man's porch. It's the Lord's work she's doing, the pastor's wife countered weakly, though even she felt a flutter of unease. The arrangement had moved beyond the bounds of a church-sanctioned charity. It had become something personal. The whispers grew, a rustling undercurrent in the town's daily life. They were not malicious, not exactly. They were born of a rigid sense of order. There were rules for widows and widowers, unspoken but strictly enforced. They were figures of communal pity and responsibility, but they were expected to remain within the neat outlines of their grief. Clara and Eli were blurring those lines, creating a shape the town did not recognize and therefore could not approve of. The gossip reached Clara, as it was meant to. She heard it in the slight hesitation before a greeting, in the way conversations quieted when she entered a room. It stung. For 11 years, she had been a model of propriety, a woman who asked for nothing and gave what she could. Now, her one small act of companionship, this quiet ritual on a lonely porch, had made her a subject of speculation. It made her angry, a low, simmering heat she hadn't felt in a long time. They saw a widow behaving improperly. They did not see a lonely woman sitting with a lonely man. The catalyst arrived on a Sunday, in the bright, unforgiving light after the church service. Mr. Henderson, a neighboring rancher, approached her on the church steps. He was a good man, a widower for 5 years, his property well managed and his reputation sterling. He was, by all accounts, a fine catch. He stood before her, his hat in his hands, his face earnest. Several other church members lingered nearby, their departure suddenly delayed. They were an audience. "Clara," he began, his voice pitched to be both private and public, "I have a great respect for you. You are a capable and fine woman." He cleared his throat. "A woman like you shouldn't be alone, and you shouldn't have to bear the weight of unkind gossip." He let that hang in the air, a clear reference to her visits to the Danner ranch. "I have a good home and a prosperous ranch," he continued, his gaze steady. "I would be honored if you would consider becoming my wife." The proposal was as solid and practical as the man who delivered it. It was an offer of safety, of respectability. It was a solution. It would silence the whispers and place her back within the accepted order of things. It was, in its way, a kind gesture, an attempt to protect her reputation as much as a declaration of affection. Clara felt the eyes of the town upon her. She looked at Mr. Henderson's honest, hopeful face. He was offering her a life she understood, a partnership based on mutual respect and practicality. It was a sensible path. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "That is a generous offer. May I have some time to consider it?" He nodded, relieved. "Of course. Take all the time you need." For 2 days, Clara existed in a state of suspended animation. She went about her chores, her hands moving through their familiar tasks, but her mind was miles away. She weighed Henderson's offer like a gold scale, balancing its merits. A good husband, a fine home, an end to loneliness, an end to the gossip. It was a life of settled comfort, a safe harbor after years of navigating her own small boat. But her thoughts kept drifting west, to a dusty porch and a quiet man. She thought of the mended rail, the swept steps, the 2 glasses of water waiting for her in the fading light. Mr. Henderson offered her a complete, finished life. Eli Danner offered, what? A broken-down ranch. A man still finding his way back from the brink. A shared silence that felt more real than all of Mr. Henderson's sensible words. For 11 years, she had tended to other people's needs, smoothed over other people's grief. She had lived a life of response, of quiet duty. The basket of food, the mended shirt, the comforting word, these were her currency. She had never asked for anything for herself. She had never claimed anything. The realization came to her on Tuesday morning as she collected eggs from the coop. Mr. Henderson's proposal was another form of duty, a respectable role for her to step into. It was safe, but it was not hers. The quiet evenings on Eli's porch, however strange and undefined, were something she had chosen, something she had built, one Thursday at a time. It was the first thing in 11 years that belonged only to her. She had spent enough of her life tending to what was broken in others. Maybe it was time to help build something new. For herself, she did not wait for Thursday. She saddled her horse, her movements quick and decisive. She rode west, the midday sun warm on her back. As she approached the Danner ranch, a new sound reached her, cutting through the familiar quiet. The rhythmic thud of a post driver, the sharp, clean sound of work. She saw him before he saw her. He was out by the far pasture, the one that bordered her own small property. He was mending the fence line, a stretch of wire and rotting posts that had been neglected for at least 2 years. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his back and shoulders straining with the effort of driving a new post into the hard, dry earth. Sweat stained his shirt. His hands were covered in dirt. He was no longer a ghost on a porch. He was a man, solid and real, rebuilding his world. He was already halfway back to the living. She reined in her horse a short distance away and watched him. He worked with a steady, powerful rhythm, a man reacquainting himself with his own strength. He finished driving the post, straightened up to wipe his brow with the back of his arm, and finally saw her. He froze. The hammer in his hand lowered slowly to his side. He looked at her, then at the sun, high in the sky. It was Tuesday. His expression was a mixture of confusion and a deep, guarded apprehension. He thought he knew why she was there. She had come to tell him her decision. She had come to say goodbye. She dismounted and walked toward him, the dry grass crunching under her boots. She stopped at the new fence line, the freshly strung wire a tangible boundary between them. "Clara," he said. Her name sounded different in the open air, less a whisper, more a statement. "What are you doing, Eli?" she asked, her voice calm. He looked down at the post driver, then back at her. Fences need mending. It was a simple, practical answer, but they both knew it was more than that. "This one's been needing it for a long time," she said, her gaze direct. "Why now?" He leaned the driver against the post and looked at his hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. "A man can't let everything fall to ruin," he said quietly. He took a deep breath, the kind a man takes before diving into deep water. "I heard about Mr. Henderson's offer." "Yes," she said, "just that." He finally met her eyes, and she saw in them a vulnerability that took her breath away. The distant, faded blue was gone, replaced by a clear, intense focus. He was looking at her, truly seeing her, and he was afraid of what he was about to lose. "He's a good man," Eli said, his voice level. "He can offer you a proper home, respectability. He can give you what you deserve." He was making Henderson's case for him, laying out all the sensible reasons she should accept. He was preparing to let her go. "And what can you offer, Eli?" The question was soft, but it landed with the force of a hammer blow. It was the question he had been asking himself for 2 sleepless nights. He looked away, toward the horizon, toward the ranch house that still held so many ghosts. "Not much," he admitted, his voice raw with honesty. "A broken-down ranch. A lot of work. A quiet man who's been slow. Too slow." He turned back to her, his gaze unwavering. "I've been living in the past, Clara. For 2 years. You were the first thing that felt like the present. The first thing that made me think about a future." He took a step toward the fence, his hands gripping the top wire. "I know I'm late in saying it. And I know it's not much against what Henderson is offering. But I'm fixing the fences. I'm fixing the house. I'm trying to fix myself." He paused, gathering his courage. "I don't want to just sit on that porch with you on Thursdays, Clara. I want to sit there with you every day. As my wife." It was not a polished speech. It was a plain-spoken declaration, direct and unadorned, and it was the most beautiful thing Clara had ever heard. It was an offer not of a finished life, but of a life to be built, together. A slow smile spread across her face, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. "It took you long enough, Eli Danner." Relief washed over his face so powerfully he seemed to sag against the fence. "I told you," he said, a shaky laugh in his voice. "I'm slow." "You got there," she said softly. "That's what matters." Their courtship was as quiet and steady as they were. Eli came to her house for supper now, sitting at her small kitchen table instead of on the porch. He walked with her after church on Sundays, his presence at her side a clear, unspoken announcement that silenced the town's gossip more effectively than any argument could have. The whispers did not stop, but their tone changed, from speculation to a kind of grudging, then growing, approval. They spent their days working. He worked on his ranch, and she on hers, but often their work would meet at the fence line he was so diligently rebuilding. They would talk as he strained wire or she checked on her cattle, their conversations weaving a tapestry of plans for the future. They were not just mending a fence, they were joining two properties, two lives. He was a man of action, and his love was expressed in the solid thud of his hammer, in the straight lines of his new fences, in the way he started to repair the roof of her small barn without her even having to ask. Her love was in the hot meals she brought out to him, in the quiet way she listened as he began, haltingly at first, to speak of Sarah, not as a ghost between them, but as a cherished memory of a life that had been, allowing him to finally imagine a life that could be. They were married in the fall, on a crisp October afternoon. The church was full. The whole of Teller's Creek seemed to be there, their collective presence a final, communal blessing on a union that had begun in defiance of their judgment. Clara wore a simple dress of deep blue, the color of the evening sky on Eli's porch. Eli stood straight and solid beside her, his eyes, clear and focused, never leaving her face. The ceremony was short and simple, the pastor's words a quiet confirmation of what they both already knew. They were home. 5 years later, the porch was the same, but different. The wood was worn smooth by the passage of time and the weight of a shared life. The two chairs were still there, their seats slightly hollowed, companions in stillness. It was evening, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut hay and blooming night phlox. Eli came out of the house, a cup in each hand. He handed one to Clara. She took a sip and a small, familiar smile played on her lips. "Coffee. You know I prefer tea," she said, the words a comfortable refrain. "A man can hope to change your mind," he answered, his own smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. He was no longer spare and angular. The years of hard work and happiness had settled on him, returning him to the solid, steady man he had once been. From inside the house came a shriek of laughter, followed by the sound of small, running feet. A moment later, a 4-year-old boy with his father's quiet eyes and a stubborn tuft of blonde hair ran onto the porch, pursued by his older sister, a girl of 6 with her mother's capable hands and determined expression. "He took my doll," the girl announced, planting her hands on her hips. The boy, Thomas, held up a small cornhusk doll, his face a picture of innocent mischief. "Give it back, Tom," Eli said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "And you, Sarah, come sit with your mother." The boy handed over the doll with a sigh, then climbed into his father's lap, settling against his chest. The girl, named for the woman whose chair her mother had first sat in, curled up beside Clara, leaning her head against her arm. They sat in a comfortable silence, the 4 of them, watching the last light fade from the sky, painting the clouds in shades of peach and lavender. The Danner ranch was no longer a place of ruin. It was a thriving, vibrant home, its fences strong, its fields productive, its house filled with warmth and laughter. Eli looked out over the land, his land, their land. He drew his son a little closer. "Took me long enough to fix that fence," he said, his gaze settling on the far pasture line, now straight and true. Clara reached over and placed her hand on his, her fingers lacing through his strong, calloused ones. "You got there," she said. And that was the thing, really. Love wasn't always a lightning strike. Sometimes it was a slow mending. It was the quiet courage to sit in an empty chair, to show up when you weren't asked, to drive a new post into hard ground. It wasn't about the speed of the journey. It was about arriving. It was about having the patience and the hope to know that even the most broken things could be made whole again.